Tonight, we journey back to a quiet autumn evening in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, a place known for endless forests, mist-covered mountains, gentle rainfall, and small towns tucked between rivers and valleys. This is not a story of loud adventure or dramatic conflict. Instead, it is a story wrapped in mystery. A mystery that has remained unsolved for more than half a century. It begins on a rainy afternoon in November of 1971. As you listen, allow your breathing to slow. Feel your shoulders relax. Let the events of the day drift away, and together let us travel back to a different time. A slower time, a quieter time, a time before smartphones, before the internet, and before anyone had ever heard the name D.B. Cooper. The date was November 24th, 1971. Thanksgiving was only a day away. Across America, millions of people were preparing for family gatherings. Turkeys were being cooked. Children were looking forward to holidays. Airports were busy with travelers heading home. At Portland International Airport in Oregon, the weather was typical for late November. Gray clouds filled the sky. A light rain fell steadily. The air smelled of wet pavement and evergreen trees. Inside the airport terminal, travelers moved calmly through the building. Some carried briefcases, others carried suitcases. Businessmen checked their watches. Families gathered near departure gates. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Among the travelers was a man who attracted almost no attention. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, perhaps a little older. He stood around 6 feet tall. His hair was dark. His face was calm and expressionless. He wore a dark suit, polished shoes, a white dress shirt, and a narrow black tie. A raincoat hung neatly over one arm. To anyone who glanced at him, he looked like an ordinary businessman, the kind of man people saw every day, the kind of man who could disappear into a crowd without anyone noticing. He approached the ticket counter and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. The flight would take less than an hour, a short trip, nothing unusual. When asked for his name, he provided one. Dan Cooper. The ticket agent printed the ticket. The man paid cash. Then he quietly walked toward the boarding gate. No one realized that this simple transaction would become part of one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Outside, rain tapped softly against the airport windows. Jets landed and departed. Ground crews moved across the tarmac. Everything continued as normal. A short time later, boarding began for Northwest Orient Flight 305. Passengers formed a line. They handed over their tickets and entered the aircraft. The airplane was a Boeing 727. At the time, it was one of the most popular passenger aircraft in America. Reliable, comfortable, and equipped with a unique feature that would later become very important. At the rear of the aircraft was a staircase that could be lowered from the tail section. Most passengers never thought about it. But on this particular evening, that staircase would become famous. The man known as Dan Cooper boarded the plane without hurry. He selected seat 18C, a window seat near the rear of the aircraft. He sat down quietly, placed his briefcase beside him, and gazed out the window. The rain continued to fall. Small droplets slowly rolled across the glass. The airport lights reflected in the wet pavement below. For a few moments, everything was peaceful. Passengers settled into their seats. Some opened newspapers. Others looked through magazines. A few chatted quietly with companions. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, helping travelers store luggage and find their seats. Soon, the aircraft doors closed. The engines began to hum. The sound gradually grew louder. The airplane pushed away from the gate and slowly moved toward the runway. Outside, darkness was beginning to arrive. November evenings in the Pacific Northwest often feel longer than elsewhere. Clouds block much of the sunlight. The world becomes gray and quiet. The Boeing 727 paused briefly at the runway. Then the engines roared. The aircraft accelerated faster and faster until finally the wheels left the ground. Flight 305 lifted smoothly into the rainy sky. The city lights below began to shrink. Roads became thin, glowing lines. Buildings became tiny shapes. Soon the airplane entered the clouds. Passengers relaxed as the flight settled into its climb. The journey to Seattle would be short, less than an hour. Many travelers expected to arrive before dinner. No one imagined they were about to become part of a story that people would still discuss more than 50 years later. A flight attendant named Florence Schaffner moved through the cabin performing her usual duties. She smiled at passengers, answered questions, collected requests for drinks. Everything seemed routine. Then the man in seat 18C handed her a folded piece of paper. At first, she barely looked at it. Occasionally, passengers would write phone numbers or friendly messages. She assumed it was something similar. Without opening it, she slipped it into her pocket. The man watched calmly. Then he leaned slightly toward her. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and he said something she would never forget. "Miss, you'd better look at that note." Florence paused. She removed the paper, carefully unfolded it, and began to read. What she saw instantly changed the course of the evening. The note claimed that the man had a bomb, and that he wanted her to sit beside him, quietly, without drawing attention, without causing panic. The mystery of D.B. Cooper had just begun. Florence Schaffner tried to remain calm. Years later, she would remember the moment clearly. The cabin around her seemed unchanged. Passengers continued reading newspapers. A businessman adjusted his glasses. Someone looked out the window at the dark clouds. Another passenger quietly sipped a drink. No one appeared aware that anything unusual was happening. Yet in Florence's hands was a note claiming that a passenger carried a bomb. For a brief moment, she wondered if it might be some kind of joke. But the man sitting beside her did not seem like someone making jokes. His face remained calm. His voice remained steady. There was no sign of nervousness, no sign of excitement. In fact, he seemed remarkably relaxed. The man motioned toward the briefcase resting beside him. Carefully, he opened it just enough for Florence to see inside. She glanced down. Inside were several red cylindrical objects. They appeared to be connected by wires. To Florence, it certainly looked like a bomb. Whether it truly was a bomb would remain one of the many unanswered questions in the story. But at that moment, she had no reason to doubt him. The situation was real, very real. The man quietly explained his demands. He wanted $200,000 in cash. He wanted 4 parachutes, and he wanted these items delivered when the aircraft landed in Seattle. His instructions were precise. His tone remained polite. He never raised his voice. He never threatened passengers directly. He simply explained what he wanted. Florence listened carefully. Then she carried the information to the cockpit. Inside the cockpit, the flight crew immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. The captain was William Scott, an experienced pilot. Along with his crew, he contacted air traffic control. Soon, the message reached airline officials, then federal authorities, then law enforcement agencies. Within minutes, people on the ground were scrambling to respond. Meanwhile, the passengers remained unaware. The aircraft continued northward through the cloudy evening sky. The city lights below flickered through breaks in the clouds. Forests stretched endlessly beneath the airplane. Rivers wound through the landscape like silver ribbons. The Pacific Northwest looked peaceful from above. No one could see the tension quietly unfolding inside the aircraft. Authorities on the ground faced a difficult decision. They wanted everyone safe, the passengers, the crew, even the mysterious hijacker. The easiest way to achieve that goal was to cooperate. Preparations began immediately. Banks were contacted, cash was gathered, parachutes were located, arrangements were made at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Yet these tasks would take time, more time than remained in the short flight from Portland to Seattle. As a result, the aircraft was instructed to remain in the air for nearly 2 hours. Flight 305 circled above Washington State. From the cabin windows, passengers could see darkness spreading across the landscape below. Some wondered why the flight seemed delayed. Others paid little attention. Air travel delays were not unusual. The mystery remained hidden. While the airplane circled, Cooper appeared surprisingly comfortable. At one point, he ordered a bourbon and soda. The flight attendant brought the drink. Cooper thanked her politely, then he paid for it. That detail would become one of the most famous facts in the entire case. Even while carrying out a hijacking, he paid for his beverage. The image fascinated people. It seemed almost impossible. Yet numerous witnesses confirmed it. The more investigators learned about Cooper, the stranger he seemed. He was not loud, not aggressive, not reckless. He behaved more like a businessman attending a meeting. He spoke calmly, used polite language, and appeared completely in control. As the evening continued, authorities prepared the ransom. The money was carefully collected. Most of the bills were $20 notes. Investigators photographed the serial numbers. This would allow them to track the money if it ever appeared in circulation. Thousands of individual bills were recorded, every serial number documented, every bundle prepared. The parachutes were gathered as well. Cooper had specifically requested 4 parachutes. This puzzled investigators. Why 4? Some believed he wanted authorities to think he might force hostages to jump with him. If officials suspected that, they would be less likely to sabotage the parachutes. Whether that was truly his reasoning remains unknown. Like many aspects of the case, it became another mystery. As darkness deepened outside, Seattle prepared for the aircraft's arrival. Emergency vehicles waited nearby. Police officers remained at a distance. Airport officials coordinated every detail. Yet, despite all the activity, the goal was simple. Avoid panic. Protect the passengers. Resolve the situation peacefully. Back inside the cabin, Cooper occasionally looked out the window. The world below was mostly hidden by darkness. Only scattered lights appeared here and there, small towns, roads, farmhouses, the occasional passing vehicle. Beyond them stretched vast forests and mountains, quiet places that seemed untouched by time. Perhaps Cooper was studying the landscape. Perhaps he was simply waiting. No one could know what he was thinking. As the hours passed, the aircraft finally received permission to land. Seattle was ready. The money had arrived. The parachutes were available. The runway lights shone brightly through the darkness. The Boeing 727 slowly descended through the clouds. Passengers felt the familiar sensation of landing. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Its wheels rolled across the wet runway, and at last, Flight 305 came to a stop. Outside, the airport glowed beneath floodlights. Rain continued falling softly. Emergency vehicles stood in the distance. Everything had been arranged exactly as Cooper requested. The cash was delivered. The parachutes were brought aboard. Then something unexpected happened. Something that would further shape Cooper's strange reputation. He allowed every passenger to leave safely. No one was harmed. No one was injured. One by one, the passengers gathered their belongings and exited the aircraft. Many still had little idea how extraordinary the evening had become. Soon the cabin grew quiet. The seats emptied. The conversations faded. The ordinary travelers disappeared into the terminal. Only a handful of people remained aboard. The flight crew, several flight attendants, and the mysterious man known as Dan Cooper. The next stage of the mystery was about to begin, and before the night was over, he would vanish into history. The cabin of Flight 305 felt very different now. Only a short time earlier, dozens of passengers had filled the seats. Conversations had drifted through the air. Newspapers had rustled softly. Travelers had looked forward to arriving home before Thanksgiving. Now the aircraft was almost empty. Outside, rain continued falling across Seattle. Airport lights reflected on the wet pavement. The night had fully arrived, and inside the airplane, only a few people remained. The flight crew waited patiently. The flight attendants followed instructions carefully, and the mysterious man known as Dan Cooper examined the items that had been delivered. The ransom money sat nearby, $200,000, an enormous amount of money in 1971. The cash had been packed neatly into bundles, thousands of individual bills, everyone recorded by investigators, every serial number carefully documented. Cooper inspected the money. He appeared satisfied. Then he turned his attention to the parachutes. Again, he examined them calmly. No excitement, no celebration, no sign of nervousness. Only the same steady, controlled behavior witnesses had observed all evening. Many years later, investigators would still be discussing this unusual calmness. Most criminals experience stress, fear, excitement. Yet Cooper seemed different. He behaved like a man carrying out a carefully planned task, as if he had already imagined every step long before boarding the aircraft. Once he finished inspecting the money and parachutes, Cooper gave new instructions. The airplane would take off again. This time, it would head south, eventually toward Mexico. The crew listened carefully. The instructions were specific. The aircraft should fly at a relatively low altitude. It should travel at a moderate speed, and the landing gear should remain partially deployed. The pilots explained that some requests might not be possible, but they agreed to follow his instructions as closely as safety allowed. Again, Cooper remained polite. He discussed the details calmly, like a businessman negotiating arrangements, not like the dramatic villains people imagined from movies. Outside, preparations began. The aircraft was refueled. Ground crews completed their work. Airport officials waited. The situation remained tense, but remarkably peaceful. No one had been harmed, and everyone hoped it would remain that way. Finally, Shortly after 7:30 in the evening, the Boeing 727 prepared for departure. The engines came alive once more. Their familiar hum echoed through the rainy night. The aircraft slowly rolled away from its parking position, then moved toward the runway. Inside the cockpit, the pilots focused on their tasks. Inside the cabin, Cooper gathered his belongings. The money, the parachutes, his briefcase, everything appeared ready. The aircraft accelerated down the runway faster and faster, then smoothly lifted into the dark sky. Seattle disappeared beneath the clouds. The city lights grew smaller. Soon, only darkness surrounded the airplane. Far below stretched forests, rivers, mountains, and isolated communities. The Pacific Northwest at night is a vast and quiet place. Large areas remain covered by wilderness. Miles of evergreen forests blanket the landscape. Mountain ranges rise into the clouds. Rivers carve pathways through valleys. On a dark, rainy evening, much of this world becomes invisible. Only occasional lights reveal signs of human life. As Flight 305 moved southward, Cooper began making preparations. He instructed the remaining flight attendants to move forward. Most were eventually sent into the cockpit area. Only one flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, remained in contact with him for part of the journey. Tina later described him as calm and respectful. He never appeared angry, never shouted, never behaved recklessly. Even under extraordinary circumstances, he remained composed. At one point, Cooper asked Tina simple questions about the aircraft, questions that suggested he possessed at least some knowledge of aviation. He seemed familiar with the Boeing 727, particularly its unusual rear staircase. This detail would become extremely important because among commercial aircraft of the era, the Boeing 727 possessed a unique feature, a stairway built into the rear of the plane. Unlike most aircraft, passengers could board or exit through stairs that folded directly from the tail section. Most people never thought much about it, but investigators would later wonder whether Cooper selected the Boeing 727 specifically because of this design. Perhaps he knew exactly what he intended to do. Perhaps he had researched it carefully, or perhaps it was simply coincidence. No one could be certain. As the flight continued through the darkness, rain occasionally struck the aircraft. Wind moved around the fuselage. Clouds drifted past unseen. Inside the cabin, Cooper worked quietly. At some point, he tied the money bag to his body. He examined parachute equipment. He prepared for whatever would happen next. The pilots remained focused on flying. The route carried them southward across Washington State, toward Oregon, toward areas covered by forests and mountains, remote places where very few people lived, the kind of places that seemed endless when viewed from above. Hours passed slowly. The cabin remained quiet. Only the steady sound of the engines filled the darkness. Then Cooper gave another instruction. No one was to come into the rear cabin. No one was to approach him. The crew was to remain forward. Behind them, he would be alone. Tina Mucklow eventually moved toward the cockpit as instructed. Before leaving, she glanced back one final time. The mysterious passenger remained seated, calm, focused, surrounded by money, parachutes, and questions that would soon become famous around the world. The cockpit door closed. Now, Cooper was completely alone. The crew could no longer see him. Only the sounds of the aircraft remained. Minutes passed. Then, more minutes. The airplane continued southward through the darkness. Somewhere below lay rivers winding through forests, tiny communities sleeping beneath rainy skies, mountain peaks hidden behind clouds. Then, around 8 p.m., something unusual happened. The pilots felt a slight movement, a change in the aircraft's behavior. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Instruments indicated that the rear staircase might have been lowered. The airplane seemed to experience a brief shift, a small change in air pressure, a subtle movement that suggested activity in the rear section. The crew exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone understood what might be happening. Somewhere behind them, beyond the closed cabin door, Cooper was putting his plan into action. Outside conditions were harsh. Cold temperatures, heavy darkness, rain, strong winds, thousands of feet above the ground. Below stretched miles of wilderness. Yet, despite all those challenges, Cooper appeared ready. And within the next few minutes, he would perform one of the most daring acts in American criminal history. A jump into the darkness, a leap into the unknown, and the beginning of a mystery that would endure for generations. The night sky above the Pacific Northwest was cold and dark. Far below, forests stretched for miles in every direction. The rain continued to fall. Clouds drifted across the landscape, hiding mountains, rivers, and small towns beneath a blanket of darkness. Inside the Boeing 727, the pilots remained at their stations. The cockpit was quiet, except for the steady hum of instruments and the deep sound of the engines. No one could see what was happening in the rear cabin. The mysterious passenger was alone. Minutes passed slowly. The crew listened carefully. Every sound seemed important. Every vibration attracted attention. Then came another slight movement. The aircraft shifted again. Not violently, just enough for the pilots to notice. It felt as though weight inside the plane had changed position. Captain William Scott later described the sensation as unusual but not alarming. The aircraft continued flying normally. Still, everyone suspected the same thing. Cooper was preparing to leave. Outside, conditions were far from ideal. The airplane was flying at approximately 10,000 feet. The temperature was near freezing. Rain and strong winds swept through the darkness. Visibility was poor. The forests below appeared as an endless black sea. Most people would never consider jumping into such conditions. Yet Cooper seemed determined. No one knows exactly what happened during those final moments. No cameras recorded the event. No witnesses watched it unfold. There were no dramatic photographs, no final conversations, only clues, only possibilities, and a mystery. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the crew noticed a sudden upward movement of the aircraft. It was brief but distinct. Investigators later believed this may have been the moment Cooper jumped. If that theory is correct, then somewhere over southwestern Washington state, a lone figure stepped from the rear staircase of a moving jetliner and disappeared into the night. Imagine that moment. The roar of the engines, the cold wind, the darkness stretching endlessly below, rain striking the aircraft, clouds moving through the sky. Then, one final step, and silence. The Boeing 727 continued flying south. The crew remained in the cockpit. No one immediately checked the rear cabin. They followed Cooper's instructions and waited. Only later, when the aircraft landed safely, would they discover what had happened. The flight continued for nearly another hour. Eventually, the aircraft reached Reno, Nevada. Airport officials had prepared for its arrival. Law enforcement officers waited nearby. Emergency vehicles stood ready. The runway lights stretched into the darkness. As the aircraft descended, everyone wondered the same thing. Would Cooper still be aboard? Had he changed his mind? Had something gone wrong? The Boeing touched down smoothly. Its wheels rolled across the runway. The engine slowed. Finally, the aircraft came to a stop. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then authorities moved quickly. Officers approached the aircraft carefully. The cabin door opened. Search teams entered. Seat by seat, they examined the plane. The answer soon became clear. Cooper was gone. The rear staircase showed signs of use. Several items remained behind. But the mysterious passenger had vanished. Only a black clip-on tie remained on one of the seats, along with a few other personal items. The money was gone. The parachutes were gone. And so was the man who had taken them. The mystery had officially begun. News spread rapidly. By morning, newspapers across America were reporting the astonishing story. A man had hijacked an aircraft, collected a ransom, and apparently jumped into the darkness, then disappeared. The public was fascinated. Many people doubted anyone could survive such a jump. The weather had been terrible. The terrain below was rugged and remote. The conditions seemed almost impossible. Others believed the opposite. They argued that Cooper appeared intelligent and prepared. Perhaps he knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps he had military experience. Perhaps he had trained for such a jump. No one knew. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, commonly known as the FBI, immediately launched a massive investigation. Agents gathered evidence from the aircraft. They interviewed witnesses. They examined every detail. The tie Cooper left behind became an important clue. The note he had handed to the flight attendant was gone. Unfortunately, it had not been preserved. One of the most valuable pieces of evidence had disappeared. Investigators began interviewing everyone who had seen Cooper. Flight attendants described him in detail. Passengers shared memories. Artists created sketches based on witness descriptions. Soon, newspapers across the country published drawings of the mysterious man. Millions of Americans studied his face. Someone, investigators believed, must recognize him. Someone must know who he was. But no one came forward. The search extended far beyond the aircraft. Teams examined maps. Meteorologists analyzed weather conditions. Experts calculated flight paths. Military personnel assisted in locating potential landing zones. The Pacific Northwest contains vast wilderness areas. Dense forests cover large regions of Washington State and Oregon. Mountains rise above valleys. Rivers cut through remote landscapes. Searching such an area was incredibly difficult. Helicopters flew over forests. Ground teams walked through rugged terrain. Investigators searched fields, roads, and riverbanks. They hoped to find a parachute, a money bag, a piece of clothing, anything that could reveal what happened after the jump. Days passed. Nothing. Weeks passed. Still nothing. Winter arrived. Snow covered portions of the search area. Rain continued falling across the region. The mystery grew deeper. Many investigators privately concluded that Cooper had not survived. The jump seemed too dangerous, the weather too severe, the terrain too unforgiving. Yet there was a problem with that theory. If Cooper had died, where was the evidence? Where was the body? Where was the money? Where was the parachute? The search produced almost nothing. It was as though the wilderness had swallowed every trace. Years passed. The FBI continued investigating. New suspects appeared, then disappeared. Hundreds of leads arrived from across the country. Some people claimed Cooper was a neighbor. Others believed He was a former soldier. Some suspected airline employees. Others suspected professional criminals. Each theory generated excitement. Each theory eventually collapsed. The mystery refused to be solved. And as time passed, D.B. Cooper slowly transformed from a criminal into a legend, a strange figure wrapped in uncertainty, a man who appeared briefly in history, then vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only questions. And somewhere out there, beyond the forests and mountains of the Pacific Northwest, the answer remained hidden. And so the years continued to pass. The mystery remained. The forests remained. The rivers continued flowing toward the sea. And somewhere within that vast landscape, the story of D.B. Cooper settled into history, not as a solved case, not as a completed investigation, but as something far more unusual, a mystery that refused to disappear. By the second decade of the 21st century, investigators had spent more than 40 years studying the case. Thousands of leads had been examined, countless theories had been proposed, boxes upon boxes of documents filled archives, witness statements, maps, photographs, evidence reports, scientific analyses, and still the central question remained unanswered. Who was Cooper? Eventually, in 2016, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the case. The agency explained that it needed to focus resources on newer priorities. The Cooper file would remain preserved. But the intensive search was largely over. For many people, the announcement felt like the closing of a long chapter. Yet even then, the mystery did not end. Independent researchers continued searching. Writers continued studying. Historians continued debating. The story remained alive. Because mysteries do not always belong to investigators. Sometimes they belong to everyone. And this mystery had become part of American folklore. Like old tales passed down beside campfires, like stories told during long journeys, like legends whispered across generations. The image remained unforgettable. A man in a dark suit, a rainy afternoon, a brief flight, a calm voice, a ransom, a parachute, and a leap into darkness. Few stories are so simple and yet so impossible to explain. Imagine for a moment that final night once again. The aircraft moving steadily through the clouds, the sound of engines surrounding the cabin, the darkness outside the windows, rain drifting through cold air. Below, forests stretching beyond the horizon, rivers winding through valleys, mountains hidden beneath clouds. Then imagine the silence after the jump. The aircraft continues onward, its lights moving through the night sky. The crew remains inside. The passengers are gone. And somewhere below, a mystery begins. A mystery that would outlive presidents, outlive governments, outlive technologies, outlive generations. The world changed dramatically after 1971. The internet arrived, mobile phones appeared, satellites expanded across the sky. Computers transformed everyday life. Information became easier to access than ever before. Yet despite all those advances, the mystery remained. Sometimes that surprises people. We often imagine that modern technology can answer every question, but some questions originate in a different era. An era of paper tickets, cash transactions, limited surveillance, and vast wilderness. Those conditions allowed mysteries to survive, and perhaps that is why the Cooper story feels almost timeless. It belongs to a world that no longer exists, a world where a stranger could purchase an airline ticket with cash, board a plane, and disappear into history. As the years passed, the forests beneath Cooper's flight path continued growing. Trees that were young in 1971 became tall and strong. Streams followed familiar paths through valleys. Seasons arrived and departed. Autumn leaves fell. Winter snow covered mountain peaks. Spring rains returned. Summer sunlight warmed the rivers. Nature continued its quiet rhythm, unaffected by investigations, unaffected by headlines, unaffected by human curiosity. The wilderness simply remained, patient, silent, enduring, and perhaps somewhere within that wilderness lies the answer. Perhaps a hidden clue still waits beneath layers of soil. Perhaps an overlooked detail remains buried among forgotten records. Perhaps someday a discovery will finally explain everything, or perhaps not. Perhaps some mysteries are destined to remain mysteries. There is something peaceful about that thought. Not every question requires an answer. Not every puzzle must be solved. Sometimes uncertainty becomes part of the story itself. And perhaps that is why people continue returning to the tale of D.B. Cooper. Not because they expect certainty, but because they appreciate wonder. Because they enjoy imagining possibilities, because they find beauty in unanswered questions. Tonight, as you rest, imagine those forests once more. Picture endless evergreens standing beneath moonlit clouds. Imagine distant rivers reflecting silver light. Imagine gentle rain falling through quiet valleys. The world is calm. The night is peaceful. The mystery remains. But there is no urgency now, no investigation, no search, only the quiet passage of time. The aircraft is gone, the headlines have faded, the decades have passed. Yet somewhere in memory, the story continues drifting softly through history. A man in a suit, a rainy evening, a leap into darkness, and a question carried forward through generations. Who was D.B. Cooper? Perhaps we will never know, and that is perfectly all right. Because tonight, the answer is less important than the journey. The quiet forests, the gentle rain, the endless sky, the calm mystery moving through the darkness. Allow those images to settle peacefully in your mind. Feel your breathing become slower. Feel your thoughts become lighter. The rivers continue flowing. The forests continue swaying. The clouds continue drifting across the night sky. And somewhere far away, beyond mountains and valleys, beyond time itself, the mystery quietly sleeps. Now the story comes to rest. The rain grows softer. The wind becomes gentle. The lights fade into the distance. And the forests of the Pacific Northwest stand silent beneath the stars. Sleep peacefully, sleep deeply, and let the mystery drift away with the night.